following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Frankly Speaking. Today's episode on the show is called A Christian's Approach to Voting, which I think is very appropriate because especially since the New Hampshire primary election is just around the corner here. And America will be selecting a new president, and hopefully we'll make it happen. We'll get the fire started here in New Hampshire within the next couple of weeks. I'm your host, Frank Zaberick, and with me today is my guest, Steve Hackett, who's an intern with Merrimack Valley Baptist Church in nearby Merrimack. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what exactly do you do as an intern with Merrimack Valley Baptist Church?
Okay. Well, like you said, I'm Stephen Hackett. I'm 24 years old. I'm interning as a pastoral intern at Merrimack Valley Baptist Church. I just got recently engaged from last December to one of the pastor's daughters, Jamie Grant. I'm involved with numerous different aspects of ministry at MVBC, including teaching, preaching. On occasion, I help out plan church events. I help out with the youth department and the children's church, and involved with some of the counseling sessions with our head counselor as well.
Okay. So aside from going down to the polls and vote, do you have any experience on working on a candidate's campaign or volunteering for a group promoting a political cause?
Actually, yeah. I started working in politics when I was 14. I had been in that campaign for about 9 years, where in Massachusetts, where I lived before, we would help. I was part of an organization, the Coalition for Family and Marriage, and we would end up helping candidates from the selectman level pretty much up to the Senate level, staying within the state, help selecting candidates who adhere to Christian values, and then help them get elected from selectmen to state representatives to senators, and then we'd help out with pretty much the presidential elections as well. But primarily it was state representatives, which I primarily worked with dozens of different state representatives all over Massachusetts for office.
Now, what town are you from in Massachusetts?
I was originally from Douglas, Massachusetts. It's right near Webster. It's 30 minutes south of Worcester, essentially.
Okay, near the Connecticut border.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
There's actually a fairly long named lake there. The longest name of the lake in the country is called Lake Chargagagog, Menchagagog, Chalbunagungamog.
Wow, so yeah. That is an Indian origin, I assume.
Yeah, it means you fish on your side, I fish on my side, and nobody fishes in the middle.
Wow, okay. So this year in America should experience another first, probably another first in a presidential election as it did 8 years ago when we elected the first black to office in the office of presidency. So we'll either have the first female president in either Hillary Clinton or Carly Fiorina, or maybe we'll have our first Hispanic president in either Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio. Or if the polls are any indicators of truth and accuracy, we may have Donald Trump as our president because he's off the charts according to all these polls. So as of right now, do you have a dog in the fight as far as where you'd like to vote on the primary election?
Not necessarily right now, but I am keeping my ear to the ground to see what kind of different candidates we have because a lot can happen between now and the primaries. As we experienced with the last presidential election, evangelicals were going crazy over, for example, Herman Cain, where they were loving on him and he was the prime candidate, and then things came up to where he ended up having to excuse himself from the race. So I don't, but I am looking for the most Christ-like example, the most Christ-like candidate right now with the Christian values that we have.
Okay. Well, I can say this because it's an opinion show anyway. On my car, for example, I've got a Mike Huckabee bumper sticker on for the same reasons. I want to have like a man of God, preferably as our next president. Although the next candidate, it won't. It just seems that America isn't really taken to a man of God like I probably would.
Right, and in this case, I would have to say that it's a scenario where you just have to pick the lesser of two evils, I guess you could say.
Exactly.
Where you end up, as a Christian, you have to analyze what that candidate believes. How close are they to your value system? I mean, if Jesus was to vote in the election, I would think that he would try to find the candidate that most adheres to his way of thinking, his beliefs. What does he think about? I mean, God has a sensitive spot towards the poor. He has a sensitive spot to the fatherless. So how would that candidate treat them? Does he have integrity? Is he honest? Is he a person that cares more about others than himself? All these different moral issues. Now, don't get me wrong, economy and creating jobs and a few other different foreign relations are definitely important in the whole aspect of a presidency. But with the moral issues, God requires obedience to him in morality over pragmatism, I guess you could say.
Yeah. But like, one of the exchanges between like Jesus and Pontius Pilate, for example, Jesus said to Pontius Pilate, like, you wouldn't be in power unless God Almighty put you in power. And then there was like, Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh, who weren't really nice guys. So even though, like, and even today in this day and age, these people in like leaders in Muslim countries, Russia, China, North Korea, leaders who aren't exactly nice guys, but yet they're in power today because God, in his infinite wisdom, put them in power for...
And that is correct. And what's fantastic about our position over the biblical times and their kings and leaders is that we actually have a choice over who becomes our next leader. With the biblical times, they didn't have that choice. It was whoever killed the last king would end up becoming the new leader. But that is entirely correct what Jesus said to Pontius Pilate. God does put leaders in position. He is sovereign. He's in control over everything. But we're also commanded to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We are commanded to pray for our political leaders. And Jesus was telling the Jews this when they were conquered by Roman oppressors, people who definitely did not believe in Christ, in the God of the Jews. And he was commanding the Jews to pray for that leader, Caesar. So,
amazing.
Today, whether or not we choose Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Carly or any of the different candidates, whoever ends up winning, God ended up placing them there. Now, why? That's a totally different conversation,
Yeah.
Whether it's for punishment or reward for our relationship with God. But we're still supposed to pray for that leadership and still trying to be as Christ-like an example to the people around us instead of getting up in arms like the Jews wanted Jesus to lead a revolution. But Jesus said, no, obey the law of the land, pray for your leaders, and serve God.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of my feeling the past two presidential elections, where I wasn't too keen on Barack Obama. But, the country isn't totally in shambles yet. And one thing I can say is that, we always had a stigma of Americans, probably like on the world platform that, the Ku Klux Klan and people who were just prejudiced against black people. I don't think you can say that anymore, since we not only elected a black individual, but he was reelected 4 years later. So I think there's probably some positives with Barack Obama serving as the United States president the past 8 years or so. So
yeah, there is that. I'm of the mind where I would rather accept just to get rid of that stigmatism. I would prefer to have someone who knows what they are doing in office, and I will not claim to understand everything that goes on as the president, but I would much rather have someone be in charge of who's knowing what they're doing, who knows how to lead, who knows how to hold himself or possibly herself in that office, rather than just to appease some people who may say, well, America's racist because up until Barack Obama, we only had whites as president.
Yeah.
So there is that stigmatism, and that may be taken care of, but there's always an excuse for some type of stigmatism, because now it's, all right, who's going to be the first lady president? But then later on, even after that, you could have someone say, well, let's have a Hispanic president next. Let's have the list could go on and on with all these different sexist or racism accusations.
Exactly. So one gauge you can look at on a candidate when gauging a candidate real quick is probably how they stand on, let's say, same-sex marriage, abortions, and the military, the national defense, well, versus the economy and jobs. That usually separates the secular people from the evangelicals, probably.
Well, like I said before, it's all about being in Christ-likeness. With homosexuality, with abortion, as opposed to defense military or the economics and jobs, is that one is thinking pragmatically, whereas the other one is thinking morally. Now, Jesus would want an economy to thrive. Obviously, he's not the God of destruction, but of God of order and of God of justice. But he would want people, again, to follow him, follow his teachings, which include his stances on homosexuality, on abortion. Concerning the defense military, the Jews have attempted in the past to defend their home, and they're still defending their nation. And I believe that with America, we should defend. It just becomes a different topic of conversation when it talks about going out first instead of just defending your borders.
Oh, okay. Okay, here's an oddball question, not necessarily a biblical type question, in reference to polling. And, especially with Donald Trump, leading double-digit leads over his number two rival in the Republican primary. And if polling is based on people, an organization calling up people at night, like, for example, do you answer your phone if you see, first thing you do is probably look at the caller ID when you answer your phone?
Correct.
So I'm wondering what kind of people are given these polls to these pollster organizations?
Well, I can tell you honestly that I myself have been on the other end of the telephone. I've been on both sides of the telephone with that because of my because of my history in politics. I've been that guy who ended up make hundreds of phone calls asking different polling questions. So it all depends really on who that person is you're calling, to be quite honest. I know I'm giving you a concrete answer of perhaps, maybe. But depending on how politically involved that person is on the other line, I mean, for me and my family, we are having dinner. You don't want to be interrupted. You want to be able to finish eating and then continue on, and then maybe after that. But people generally now, in the majority, have caller ID, so they see, and if it says unknown number, then they would normally let it go to voicemail. And as a pollster, we call all sorts of different people because we want to get an accurate poll from all different types of people, of all different ethnicities, religion, and nationalities, so that way we can get an accurate depiction of what an area is voting for. So for me and my family, no, we wouldn't want to be interrupted, and I can only say that for my family, but again, it's purely based on how interested they are in politics and whether they want to contribute to that poll.
No, except unless your name is Donald. If your name isn't Donald Trump, all of them are hoping that the pollsters are all going to be wrong, way off base. Come like Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, and then the South Carolina, and so forth and so on. How accurate would you say they are? Because they're hoping for hope that they're all going to be wrong. And when people actually vote, and they're basing it mostly on the 1940 presidential race between Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey. But since then, I think the pollsters and polls have gotten a lot more sophisticated since that point in time.
And the trouble with polling, the difference between polling and going out and vote, is exactly that, going out and voting. When you call people, you're calling usually their home phones and not their cell phones. Okay. So they're already in their house and they're already there, they might want to talk, whereas going out and vote, that means they actually, as insignificant as it sounds, they actually have to leave their homes to actually go out to the polls during the day, spend time, and actually going out and vote. So that's where that jump can be erroneous in the polls. So you can have polls and polls and polls and polls because you may think you have a decent idea, but really there can be a huge difference that polls can be wrong. I have been part of campaigns where polls have said, okay, the other person is going to win, the other person is going to win, the other person by a huge margin, and then come election day, that number was correct, but just assigned to the wrong candidate, and it was totally flopped.
Wow. So I'm kind of hoping that will happen in the Republican race, but Republican primary, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we will.
So how should a Christian view negative political ads? I mean, in an ideal world, you want to hear the positives about each candidate. They just insinuate the positives about themselves. But if that's the case, like with Hillary Clinton and with the majority liberal media, they're not going to talk about Benghazi or her email scandal or anything like that. The only way you're going to find out about it is Trump and other people talking about that, making negative ads.
Right, and in a perfect world, hopefully the news would end up covering that to some degree.
Exactly.
In a perfect world. But honestly, from a Christian's point of view, I would say negative political adding, I would tag that along with gossip. Because Jesus told us, listen, whatsoever is good, think on these things. Whatsoever is just, whatsoever is right. As a Christian, we are supposed to uphold an image of Jesus. We are supposed to reflect who Christ is to the unsaved world, to everyone, both the saved and unsaved world. And if we are continuously, as a candidate or not, we are supposed to not necessarily condemn other people and say, hey, listen, focus on all the evil that person has done. We're supposed to be separated from the world. But rather, again, in a perfect world, but rather we would say, look at my integrity. Look at who I am. Am I the kind of person that you would want to elect and vote for? Which is why I said earlier, looking for honesty, looking for integrity, looking for work ethic as a candidate. But not just as a candidate, but as a person himself. And if you're able to find a candidate that anywhere resembles that kind of person, then you go for that. But there are going to be organizations that may not even be tied to the candidate that will go for the negative ads. So it's pretty much you don't even have to get your hands dirty in an election because other people will end up doing it for you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into my next question on why a lot of people supposedly love Donald Trump and his campaign, because he, what they call, speaks his mind. But I'm looking at something like that, like he's Fox reporter, correspondent Megyn Kelly. He says that she was bleeding from wherever, which is kind of obnoxious, especially from that. He says Rick Perry, who was a former Republican candidate, he was now wearing glasses to look intelligent, just to look intelligent. And probably the horrific thing, I guess there was a news reporter with one of the New York papers that reported on 9/11 and how, I don't know if it was thousands of Muslims in New Jersey were clapping when the Twin Towers went down, or, a lot of people, like a few dozen Muslims were clapping in New Jersey. But now that, the guy was saying he doesn't remember, but the guy is struck with muscular dystrophy. He has like a withered arm. I don't know if you saw the pictures, and he talks, well, you could tell he's got muscular dystrophy. And of course, Donald Trump made a big thing trying to imitate him and stuff like that, which totally ignorant.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a separation between, honesty and not lying and, speaking your mind, just using your brain for common sense and not, just like giving this guy with muscular dystrophy the benefit of the doubt and just letting his criticism go instead of, trying to imitate him and look just plain ignorant.
Well, let me answer that question with a Bible verse. You have in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, the second part of that, Paul is writing and he says, we need to take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And you don't necessarily need to get me started on what James 3 says about bridling the tongue and just the poison that can come from our tongue, the words that we say. So we are told to make sure that everything that comes out of our mouth is right. And not necessarily, and I don't mean that in an incorrect fashion. I just mean that it is good, that it is edifying, that it is building. And if we end up having to say something that is hurtful, let it be done in a loving way. Let it be done so that way it can build that other person up. So I would say no. Right now, Donald Trump, with him speaking his mind, the reason why I think that Donald Trump is doing so well right now is he is the personification of the emotions of a lot of Americans today.
Yes.
He is loud and he is angry and he's getting frustrated with the media and pretty much everyone around him. And that's how I think Americans are feeling a lot today. So that's why people are flocking to him, whether he's right or not, is because he is that personification of anger. But Christ warns us on the power of words, and just because we have a thought that comes to our mind doesn't mean that we should lift up all the different filters we have behind our tongue and just let everything that comes to our mind spew out, because it can be extremely destructive.
I agree. And also, I think a lot of people, too, I saw something on Facebook. In fact, it was a Hillary Clinton supporter making fun out of him, saying, even the town drunk speaks his mind. Everybody loves Donald Trump because he speaks his mind, but the town drunk does the same thing. But the difference with Donald Trump is he's a billionaire, a multi-billionaire, made a lot of money in real estate. So he gives the perception that he could, if elected, he could actually get things done. But at what cost? How many people are going to be offended by some of the stuff, especially if he spews out against like Muslim leaders, Russian leaders, Chinese leaders, and stuff like that? They're offended by his words. And let's say they, take over an embassy or something like that in a Muslim country or in Russia or something like that. And,
well, he definitely has the amount of money to put where his mouth is, and maybe his pride will force him to do exactly what he says. But whether or not he's a billionaire or the town drunk, as a Christian, do you think God cares about that at all? I would say no. Now, he may be a leader in some different areas, but every person has strengths and weaknesses. He may have skills that the other candidates may have, and he may have deficits that the other candidates may have personality-wise. But again, when we as Christians are looking for who to vote for, who most represents Christ, I think that is the driving question that should determine who Christians vote for. Not necessarily who is the most likely to win, not whether or not that person will be able to do the best he can do, because I don't automatically think of Gideon from the Old Testament. He had no military expertise, and yet he was put in charge by God because he obeyed God in his life. He followed after God. He followed after his commandments. He obeyed God, and even though he was unskilled in military, he was able to, with 300 soldiers, just 300 soldiers, after cutting down thousands and thousands of soldiers down, was able to take on thousands of enemy troops like that with God's help.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, so I just been informed by my producers that we have like less than 2 minutes to go till our first commercial break, our only commercial break, I should say. So we're going to take a pause right here, I think, for a pause for the cause, go to our break and kind of regroup on what we have left for the second half of our show. So hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be back when we come back for Frankly Speaking. Thank you.
It's been my privilege to be the pastor of Merrimack Valley Baptist Church for 33 years. If you're looking for a Bible preaching, teaching church, it'd be our honor to have you come and to join us. We'd love to have you come. We're on Boston Post Road, and we'd very, very grateful if you would take a few minutes to stop by and visit with us, please. Thank you. The Lord bless you. Have a good day.
With us, we have Stephen Hackett, our intern from Merrimack Valley Baptist Church in nearby Merrimack. And so getting to Christians in politics, there seems to be a stigma that most people think that Christians shouldn't get involved in politics. How do you feel about that?
Well, there definitely is a stigmatism against them when there's all these other different religions out there that we won't retaliate. And you know what? According to the different doctrines of Jesus that we're supposed to adhere to, they're right. They're absolutely right. It's a lot easier to confront Christians and persecute Christians, if I can say, because there's no fear of retaliation. We're not going to get up in arms. We're not going to riot. We're not going to overturn cars or set fire to buildings, where we have seen different religious groups do that when they have been offended. Because what does Jesus tell us in Matthew 5? We're supposed to pray for them that persecute us. We're supposed to bless people that curse us. And we're supposed to love others even when they hate us, which was the complete reverse of what the Jews thought. But that's what we're supposed to do today. So it would only make sense that they should tease or they should persecute people who they know will not retaliate.
Now, maybe I'm a little fuzzy on the Bible here. Didn't Paul the Apostle avoid persecution, I think, in Greece, by stating they had no right to persecute a Roman citizen?
What you're referring to is Paul when he was in Philippi, in the country of Philippi. He wasn't necessarily showing his Roman citizen quite yet. They had already pronounced judgment on them. They had taken him unlawfully into custody and persecuted him for his preaching in Philippi. It was not until after they had done that he revealed that he was a Roman citizen. And thus the rulers, the magistrates of that town became fearful, because then they realized they had a breach of protocol, that they unlawfully took a Roman citizen. So Paul ended up using that in order to further God's message in that. And he ended up building a church in that town as well, out of that jail that he was sent to with the Roman guardsmen and everyone.
Wow. Okay. So moving right along to a good citizen that may or may not have acted accordingly. The Kim Davis situation last summer, which this lady from Kentucky who's a town clerk refused to order the Supreme Court's decision to make homosexual marriages the law of the land. So she refused to issue any certificates of marriage to homosexual couples. Should she have resigned, or should she do what she did and go to jail because of her beliefs?
Now, for the first part of that question, I would say yes. I would think that she would have needed to resign, because as a person being employed by the government, our fickle government being constantly changed with all its laws and everything, she would have had to realize that at some point, whether favorably or unfavorably, laws would be made that would go with or against her belief system. So when that change happened, where she was required to, by law, give out homosexual marriage licenses, she should have probably gone to her employer and said, hey, because I can no longer work here under these conditions, because this goes against my belief system, I'm going to have to put in my 2 weeks, or I'm going to have to resign from this position because I will no longer, in good conscience, fulfill my responsibilities as the town clerk. Therefore, being a witness both to her coworkers and her employer, and showing the love of Christ in a way that would have been bringing glory to God in that fashion, rather than dragging her feet, trying to force the government to pay her not to do some of her responsibilities as a town clerk.
Do you think the U.S. Supreme Court acted accordingly, or do you think it was the state of Kentucky, as well as all 50 states, on whether they should have homosexual civil unions in each of their respective states? Or do you think the U.S. Supreme Court had the right to make it the law of the land that civil unions amongst homosexuals was legal?
Now, as a Christian, this is not necessarily a moral issue. This is more of a constitutional issue, because the Constitution gives some powers to the federal powers, and the majority, I would say, powers to the states. So whether or not the Supreme Court superseded their authority over the Constitution, which is supposed to be over the Supreme Court, it's a matter of interpretation of how the Supreme Court's interpreted the Constitution. Me, as a Christian, I would say that the definition of a marriage is between one man and one woman, based on what God has written in His Word, but here we're unable to say one way or another, because it's more of an interpretation of the Constitution issue rather than a moral one.
On a side note, getting back to candidates to look for, another red flag or thing to look for is who they want to support, what kind of people they'd want to support as Supreme Court justices. There's often says that as far as presidential candidates go, that's one of the most important aspects of picking a presidential candidate.
Right. And again, I would have to echo, I know I sound like a broken record, but again, it's all about Christ-likeness. It's all about Christ-likeness. Who is that candidate going to surround himself with? Is it going to be wise leaders? You think about back to the Old Testament with Jeroboam, where he had to listen either to the wise older men who knew how the country worked, or younger friends of his. And we know that he listened to his younger friends and ended up breaking up the nation. So it is obviously important who they would choose as Supreme Court justices, and that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. But again, how Christ-like are the candidates, and how Christ-like are the people that are going to surround themselves with, whether or not they are Christian or not, but how well do they value Christian values and their beliefs.
Along the same lines as Kim Davis, I don't know, well, Merrimack Valley Baptist Church, out of like 800, 900 members, they must have one or two nurses that are members. I don't know any personally, maybe you do, but anywho, I heard that there was a situation where nurses are going to be put either on talking to pregnant women that they have to advise them on their abortion rights, their abortion options. And which puts nurses in a position where they could either not do it, not tell the pregnant women about their abortion options, or get fired.
And this is what's spectacularly unique about the nurse's position. Now, I'm somewhat ignorant of all the different policies, regulations, protocols that nurses have to follow, but in this particular instance, I would say that this actually may provide those type of nurses with an opportunity for the cause of Christ, where they may have to advise the rights of an abortion on a pregnant lady, whether she's single or she has her boyfriend, fiance, or husband with her at that time. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to give advice that is positive for abortion. They could very well turn around and say, you know what, these are your rights, but there's also other options. That you have crisis pregnancy, you have CareNet, you have these different organizations which, unlike organizations like Planned Parenthood where they push for abortion, these organizations push for adoption. They push for going through with the pregnancy and being able to keep the child. And not only that, but also helping that lady or couple train their child, being able to train the parents on how to raise that child effectively. And so the nurses may have a unique opportunity from behind enemy lines, so to speak, to have a huge impact on the cause of Christ with these women and these couples going through these hard times.
Okay, so one of my last questions I have here. So in this day and age of tolerance, Steve, it just seems to me that Christians in America are being humiliated and belittled at every turn, while Muslims are getting a lot more respect in this country than they probably deserve. I don't know. It's also my understanding that, like in communities like in Dearborn, Michigan, Muslims represent the majority of residents in that particular town. Do you think that you'll see Sharia law implemented in America in your lifetime?
Frank, I'll answer the first part of that question first. That's a lot of questions.
Oh, okay.
But for the first part, yes, there's a stigmatism against Christians and I think it's caused by fear. Not fear of Christians, but fear of retaliation. We as Christians are taught by Jesus in Matthew 5 that we're supposed to bless them that curse us. We're supposed to pray for them, even if they despitefully use us. We're supposed to love them that hate us. And with that kind of easy target, it would be easier to target Christians to persecute rather than Muslims or any other religious sect that may end up causing riots, that may end up overturning cars or burning things down or whatever the religion is. But with Christians, you can probably see that there's really no fear of retaliation. But as for Sharia law, it's running rampant in Europe already. And as you stated, there are some towns where it's already running rampant in America. So would it surprise me if it started taking over America? No. But I think it's totally up to Christians, the disciples of Jesus, depending on how closely they follow his teachings and how well they spread his gospel to the people, their neighbors, their friends, their families, being able to affect their communities for the cause of Christ. So would I be surprised, again, if it showed up in my lifetime? No, but I'm hoping that we would be able to push it back. As one of my pastors says, if you look to the end of the book, if you open up the Bible and you're discouraged about what's going on around you, whether it's Sharia law, look to the last book and you'll see that in the end, we win. We win.
Amen. But it's one thing I will say about some of the president, like Donald Trump, he says that if he gets elected, he's going to start saying Merry Christmas. And Mike Huckabee says that if he gets elected, he'll have the nativity scene out on the White House front lawn, just like Barack Obama had the rainbow lights when the homosexual marriages became the law of the land. It just seems that the president is the #1 role model in the United States, and he or she should set the example and the tone of the tenor for everybody else to follow. And I would just like to see like more implementation toward Christianity. Instead, like if you watch Fox News like I do, from Thanksgiving to like Christmas, you hear these horror stories where the American Civil Liberties Union are suing like communities and cities because they have nativity scenes like in front of town hall or in front of a public library or something like that.
Right, and I actually know what you're talking about. I see it both on Facebook and on the news.
Yeah.
But again, Jesus warned us. Jesus warned us as Christians that the world hated him, and because the world hated the Son of God, they're automatically going to end up hating his followers as well. They're going to hate you, they're going to hate me because of our practice of following Jesus' teachings. The danger of having, focusing on these nativity scenes or saying Merry Christmas or having Merry Christmas printed on coffee cups is that it distracts us from the actual reason why we're celebrating Christmas and celebrating Thanksgiving. So instead of focusing totally on the nativity scene, it's like, all right, I have my right to put up a nativity scene, or I have a right to say Merry Christmas instead of Merry Xmas, or just Happy Holidays.
Yeah.
Or Happy Holidays, is that it's taking away our reflection of who Christ is, of who God is. And that is a God of love, a just and holy God, but a God of love. And so it can rile us up, putting Christians on the spot and getting us in a heated passion. But we have to be careful. It's like, okay, yes, this is a topic of controversy, but let's use it as an opportunity to spread the good news of who Christ is, rather than just saying, I have a right to put up the nativity scene. Say, well, let me tell you about what the nativity scene is about. Let me tell you why I say Merry Christmas instead of Merry Xmas or Happy Holidays. Let me tell you exactly what goes on during these holidays.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so I just been informed by my producers that we have about 12 minutes left, Steve.
Okay.
Is there anything that we discussed here today that you wish to elaborate on, and or something that I did not mention about the Christian's approach to voting that you would like to bring up?
One thing I would like to bring up is the right to vote.
Amen.
I mean, that is a huge thing. Like we were talking about earlier, the Jewish nation, the nations of old, they didn't have that right. They didn't have that privilege. Again, it was whoever killed the last emperor or king that would become the king, whether they were a godly person or not. I mean, even in the Old Testament, you have King Saul trying to kill off his successor that God himself had anointed. God himself anointed both King Saul and King David. And yet there's that jealousy there. And King David, or Farmer David at that time, he didn't lay a hand against God's anointed. And the servant who actually did end up killing Saul, even at Saul's request, David said, you laid a hand against God's elect. You laid a hand against God's chosen one. And then he ended up killing him because he believed so highly of God's choice of leadership. Now, we have been given, as American citizens, the high privilege of being able to vote. And even more so, the men and women of our military that we were talking about earlier have given up so many lives and body parts, arms, legs, and brain damage. I mean, just ask any of your military servicemen about the different horror stories that some of their friends that may have even been in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere, of the sacrifices that they had made for our rights, for our privileges as American citizens. And so, I'm getting a little passionate, but that's why it is so important to vote, whether or not you believe that there is an excellent candidate or not. But your right to actually exercise that vote has been paid for in blood. I mean, if you knew a child and you were talking to them and you're complaining about your right to vote and how you are not going to vote because none of the candidates are sufficient for you to vote for, and then that child turned around and was like, well, my dad actually died in the service so that way you could have that right. I mean, to me, that's pretty much spitting on their sacrifice. Whether you agree with the war that they're in or not, just the fact that they were willing to sacrifice what they had, their time with their families, their wives, their children, their relatives, and their friends, all the things that they have sacrificed. I have friends that are in the military, and I know for a fact that their wives, that their families go through hard times when they're gone, go through very difficult times. And so for us as citizens, as Christian citizens, to turn away from that responsibility even to vote, however insignificant you think your vote is.
And a lot of people, let me interject, a lot of people say, oh, I'm busy, I'm too busy to vote. Like in Nashua, Merrimack, Massachusetts, they have the polls open from like 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., a 13-hour span on election day.
Exactly.
I mean, I work too, an 8-hour job, but I can easily, go before or after my work and cast my vote in 10 minutes.
Exactly. And that's what I was about to say. It only takes 5 to 10 minutes to do. And the thing is, Election day is not a surprise. It's not like, oh, it's election day, I gotta go vote. I mean, you see consistent messages from, already all of the different presidential candidates. So it's not a surprise that, hey, today is election day, I need to go vote. You can schedule it in. And I realize that we're all busy. We're all very busy.
Yeah.
But for something as important as our leaders, you're gonna, if you're following the teachings of Jesus, you're going to be required by Jesus' command to pray for whoever gets elected. So put your 2 cents in. Tell other people. I would even say get politically involved, because it matters so much who the leaders are. Because as you said, Frank, our leaders will be our role models to the other nations. The other nations will base their views on America based on our leaders. So how our international relationships bend, because it's a whole knotted mess of how our relationships work with other countries. That's why it's so important to figure out who's most Christ-like. Who would we be proud of to be a leader? Who would be okay with going to the polls, going to those boxes, looking at those names, and then being able to put a check next to that? I equivocate that to my own signature, saying, I sign responsibility, God, for my vote, for this person that I'm hoping to put into office. And that's why it's so important how Christians view voting, on viewing their candidates and being able to judge them according by what they say and what they do. Finding someone who's stable in mind, finding someone who is solid in their views and will not budge from them. That's the thing. I think that's one of the main problems that both Christians and non-Christians have alike is, the pancake effect. They just flip and flop between different beliefs, whether it's about homosexuality, the military, the taxes, or abortion, all these different views. But finding someone who knows what they believe, sticks to them, whether it hurts their campaign or not. I think integrity is what the people want.
Yeah. But that's a good testimony, that's for sure. For sure.
And when I was working with, during my time in politics, when I worked with these different state representatives, we have this in our mind that they are completely non-human. That they are just a person on the TV screen, and that they're liars, and that they're just out for themselves. But during my time, I spent times in some of their homes, in the state representatives' homes. I spent time at their offices. I helped build some of their offices. And in that time, I got to know them as a human, as a person, and that they carry their own beliefs. And some of them I've met have been Christians and hold to the Christian faith. And during the campaign trail, just because of my involvement with them, they are put under a ton of stress. Their lives are a constant campaign, are a constant testimony to how they will lead. And that's not necessarily too different from a Christian's, because I view a testimony from a Christian and a politician alike are made of glass. It takes a long time to build, but just one stone's throw away from absolutely shattering. And that's why we see a lot of times.
Is
with
there
candidates.
a strong parallel between like a religion and politics in the sense of importance and a sense of belonging?
Absolutely. Absolutely. People identify themselves. They tag their identity with who they are going to vote for, with what they believe. A lot of what I learned in politics are overlapping what I'm doing currently in ministry. Being able to talk with people, public speaking, being able to relate to various groups of people. Because if you're not able to relate to various groups of people as a politician,
forget it.
Forget about it.
Yeah.
If you're not able to public speak as a politician, you're done for.
Yeah.
Same way with ministry. You have to be able to talk to all sorts of people, and I don't just mean of ethnicity or nationality, but of personality traits. There are a lot of different personalities within the ministry that you would have to not only be able to talk to, but be able to get along with, be able to encourage, be able to handle the different problems, the pros and cons of each person's personality. So there are a ton of of similarities between politics and ministry. I know that's kind of a taboo subject, but it's true. It's absolutely true.
Incredible. Okay, so anyway, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to have to definitely have you on again, probably sooner rather than later.
Okay.
But hopefully I'll get my producer to show this before the New Hampshire primary, although I think that's coming up like next week.
I believe
so. Hopefully it's going to air soon. And if not, probably the last week of October, before the general election, I'll have this particular episode air that week to give, hopefully Christians who see it in the Nashua area at least, to give them the opportunity to, hear what you have to say and stuff like that, which is a lot of fantastic testimony you disclosed here. So until next time, ladies and gentlemen, and also, if you're also blessed with what Steve had to say here, feel free anytime to visit Merrimack Valley Baptist Church, and hopefully his graphic has been underneath his name. It's mvbc.org. that you can find out. And it's a fantastic church, ladies and gentlemen. You should check it out in nearby Merrimack. So until next time we meet, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Frank Sabarik from Frankly Speaking, saying goodbye and God bless. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.